Montana Territory, 1872. The embers of Hayes Hartwell's modest campfire crackled against the twilight sky, flickering golden light across the valley that stretched before him. A lone silhouette among the vast frontier, Hayes had long believed the untamed West was no place for tender hearts. At 25, his lean, muscular frame bore the hardened resilience of a man who'd survived the unforgiving landscape through grit and solitude. His father's dying words still echoed in his mind: "Trust no one but yourself out here, boy. Attachments are just weights that'll drag you under." Hayes adjusted his worn leather hat, pushing it back to reveal eyes the color of mountain storms. 3 years of driving cattle across the territory had taught him the value of self-reliance. His weathered hands testified to countless rope burns, his sun-kissed face still youthful despite the light stubble that had grown during his 2-week journey. The Lazy H Ranch awaited his return with the horses he'd purchased, but Hayes was in no particular hurry. Solitude had become his most faithful companion. "Just you and me again, Dusty," he murmured to his dun-colored gelding grazing nearby. The horse flicked an ear in acknowledgement but continued tearing at the spring grass. Another successful trip, no complications, no surprises. That was how Hayes preferred things: predictable, controllable, safe. The war had taken his father, the influenza his mother and sister, and the cruel Montana winter his uncle just last year. Now, with the Lazy H as his only inheritance, Hayes had sealed himself against any further loss by the simplest method, allowing no one close enough to lose. He poked at the fire with a stick, watching sparks spiral upward. His supplies would last another week, which gave him plenty of time to avoid the spring celebrations back in Helena. The last thing he needed was another matchmaking attempt by the town's determined widows, pushing their daughters toward the promising young rancher with fine prospects. The sound came so faintly at first that Hayes thought he'd imagined it. A soft, lilting melody carried on the evening breeze. He tensed, hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip. Outlaws were known to use all manner of tricks to lure travelers into ambushes. The song continued, growing clearer, a woman's voice singing what sounded like an old Irish ballad. Hayes rose silently, securing his gun belt before moving toward the ridge. Dusty nickered softly in warning, but curiosity pushed Hayes forward. Crouching low, he approached the edge of the small bluff and peered down into the adjacent valley. There, no more than 100 yards distant, another campfire burned. A lone figure sat beside it, wrapped in a shawl despite the mild spring evening. The last rays of sunset caught in her hair, rich brown waves that tumbled freely down her back. Her voice, clear and unwavering, sang of distant shores and love lost to the sea. Hayes found himself holding his breath. The woman appeared entirely alone, no wagon, no companions, just a modestly sized pack and a tethered chestnut mare. Her simple blue traveling dress was dusty from the trail but well-made, suggesting she wasn't destitute. Everything about the scene violated the unwritten rules of frontier survival. No woman with sense traveled alone through Montana Territory, not with hostile tribes still occasionally raiding and road agents preying on vulnerable travelers. His first instinct was to retreat to his own camp, to mind his business and let her be. Nothing good could come of entanglements with strangers, especially one that might need protection. But even as the thought formed, Hayes knew he couldn't in good conscience leave a woman alone in this wilderness overnight. "Damn it all," he muttered, retreating to gather his rifle before approaching her camp properly. Whatever her story, he couldn't simply ride away. His father's warnings warred with his mother's teachings about decency and responsibility. Making no effort to conceal his approach, Hayes walked his horse down the gentle slope toward her camp. "Hello, the fire," he called, using the traditional traveler's greeting to announce himself from a respectful distance. "Mind if I approach, ma'am?" The singing stopped abruptly. The woman leapt to her feet with surprising agility, and Hayes found himself staring down the barrel of a small Derringer pistol. "That's close enough, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the obvious alarm in her eyes. "State your business." Hayes raised his hand slowly, keeping his voice calm. "No harm intended, ma'am. Just thought it unusual to see someone camping alone out here, particularly a lady. These parts can be dangerous." "I'm well aware of the dangers," she responded, the pistol unwavering. "And perfectly capable of defending myself, as you can see." Now that he was closer, Hayes could see her more clearly in the firelight. She was younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps 20 or 21, with features that combined delicate beauty with unmistakable determination. Her eyes, a startling shade of green, regarded him with suspicion. "I don't doubt it," Hayes replied with a hint of respect, "but that little derringer won't do much against a band of outlaws or a hungry mountain lion. I have a camp just over that ridge. Thought I might offer you some additional protection for the night." The woman's expression remained guarded, but she lowered the pistol slightly. "And why would you do that? What do you want in return?" The question, while entirely reasonable, still stung. "Nothing, ma'am. My mother raised me to offer help when needed. I'll be on my way at first light regardless." Something in his sincere tone must have reassured her, for she slowly lowered the derringer, though she didn't put it away. "I'm Hayes Hartwell," he offered, finally dropping his hands, "ranch owner from near Helena. Just returning from purchasing horses in Bozeman." A moment's hesitation, then, "Emma Grayson," she didn't elaborate further. "Miss Grayson," Hayes acknowledged with a slight tip of his hat, "may I ask what brings you out here alone?" "There's a stagecoach route not 10 miles east that would be considerably safer." Emma's posture stiffened. "I have my reasons for avoiding the main routes, Mr. Hartwell. Reasons that remain my own." Hayes recognized the steel in her voice. Whatever had driven this young woman into the wilderness alone was serious enough to risk her life. Despite his better judgment, he found himself intrigued. This was precisely the kind of complication he'd prided himself on avoiding. "Fair enough," he conceded. "I'll not pry, but my offer stands. I can keep watch tonight and escort you to wherever you're heading tomorrow if you'd like." Emma studied him silently, weighing invisible calculations. Finally she sighed. "Very well, Mr. Hartwell, you may share my fire tonight, but understand this, I sleep lightly and this derringer never leaves my side." Hayes couldn't help the small smile that tugged at his lips. "Understood, Miss Grayson. I wouldn't expect anything less." When Hayes returned with his belongings, Emma had added more wood to her fire. The flames illuminated her face in golden light, revealing a small scar near her right temple that he hadn't noticed before. She sat rigidly, her pack positioned strategically behind her, her mare now tethered closer to the fire. "Coffee," she offered stiffly as he settled across from her, maintaining a respectful distance. "Thank you," Hayes replied, accepting the tin cup she extended. The brew was strong and surprisingly good. "You've done this before, camping in the wilderness?" It wasn't a question, but Emma nodded anyway. "I grew up traveling with my father. He was a geologist for mining companies. We spent more nights under stars than roofs." The information seemed safe enough to share, but revealed little about her current circumstances. Hayes sipped his coffee, trying to ignore his growing curiosity. "And you, Mr. Hartwell, you said you own a ranch." "The Lazy H, it's modest but growing, belonged to my uncle before he passed last winter." Emma's expression softened slightly. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you." Hayes stared into the fire, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "It's been a hard few years for many out here." Indeed, Emma tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, revealing a simple gold earring. "The war changed everything." The way she said it suggested personal experience with that change, but Hayes didn't press. They fell into silence, interrupted only by the crackling fire and distant coyote calls. Hayes took first watch despite Emma's insistence she didn't need protection. He sat with his back against his saddle, rifle across his lap, gazing at the star-strewn sky. Behind him, Emma had finally succumbed to sleep, wrapped tightly in her blanket, the derringer still clutched in her hand. Against his will, Hayes found himself wondering about her story. What had driven this beautiful, capable woman into the wilderness alone? Was she running from something or someone? The questions circled in his mind until dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Emma stirred as the first rays of sunlight crested the distant mountains. Hayes had already rekindled the fire and set coffee to boil, hunting through his supplies for something more substantial than jerky to offer for breakfast. "You didn't wake me for my watch," Emma accused, sitting up and running a hand through her tangled hair. "Wasn't tired," Hayes shrugged. "Coffee's almost ready." Emma looked as though she wanted to argue, but instead sighed and reached for her pack. "I have some biscuits left from yesterday. They're a bit hard, but better than nothing." As they shared their meager breakfast, Hayes debated his next move. Common courtesy demanded he offer continued protection. Common sense warned him against further involvement. "Where are you headed?" he finally asked. Emma hesitated, studying her coffee. "North, to Fort Benton, eventually." Hayes frowned. "That's nearly 100 miles through rough country." "I'm aware of the distance, Mr. Hartwell." "Hayes," he corrected automatically, "and you plan to make this journey alone." "I've managed thus far." "By luck more than skill, I'd wager," Hayes replied, immediately regretting his blunt assessment when Emma's eyes flashed with indignation. "I'll have you know I've traveled extensively throughout the territories, Mr. Hartwell. My father ensured I could shoot, ride, and navigate before I was 12 years old." "And I'm sure you're capable in ordinary circumstances," Hayes conceded, "but these aren't ordinary times. There's been trouble with road agents between here and Fort Benton. 3 stagecoaches robbed in the past month alone." This information gave Emma pause. "I hadn't heard." "News travels slowly out here," Hayes said. "Look, my ranch is on the way to Fort Benton. I could escort you that far at least. It would add only a day to my journey." The suspicion returned to Emma's eyes. "Why would you do that?" "You don't know me." The question hit at the heart of Hayes' own confusion. Why was he offering? Everything about this situation contradicted his carefully constructed rules for survival. "Because it's the right thing to do," he finally said, "and because my mother would haunt me from her grave if I left a woman to travel alone through dangerous territory when I could have helped." A ghost of a smile touched Emma's lips. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." She was. The simple past tense spoke volumes. Emma considered him thoughtfully. "Very well, Mr. Hayes, I accept your offer of escort to your ranch, but I won't be a burden. I can pull my own weight." "Never thought otherwise," Hayes replied, surprisingly relieved by her acceptance. They broke camp efficiently, with Emma proving her competence in frontier travel. By mid-morning they were riding north, the spring sun warming their backs. Hayes found himself repeatedly glancing at his companion, noting the practiced way she rode and the alertness with which she surveyed their surroundings. "You said your father was a geologist," Hayes ventured after several miles of companionable silence. "Is he no longer living?" Emma's expression tightened. "He died last year, pneumonia." "I'm sorry," Hayes knew the inadequacy of the words. "Mine passed during the war, Antietam." Emma nodded in understanding. "The war took so many." "You mentioned you were avoiding the main routes," Hayes said carefully. "Are you in some kind of trouble?" Emma's hands tightened on her reins. "Not the kind you're thinking. I'm not running from the law, if that's your concern." "It wasn't. I'm trying to reach my uncle in Fort Benton before." She stopped abruptly. "It's complicated." Hayes waited, but she offered nothing more. They continued riding, the landscape gradually transitioning from rolling prairie to more rugged terrain. By late afternoon, dark clouds had begun gathering on the western horizon. "There's a line shack about 2 miles ahead," Hayes said, eyeing the approaching storm. "Used by the cattlemen during drives. We can shelter there tonight." Emma nodded gratefully. The first fat raindrops were beginning to fall as they reached the small, crude cabin nestled in a stand of pines. It was little more than a single room with a stone fireplace, but it would provide adequate protection from the elements. Hayes tended to the horses while Emma assessed their shelter. By the time he entered, she had already started a fire and was examining the cabin's meager provisions, a few cans of beans, coffee, and salt pork left by previous occupants. "It's not much, but it will keep us dry," Hayes said, shaking water from his hat. "It's perfect," Emma replied, surprising him with her genuine smile. The expression transformed her face, revealing dimples in both cheeks and lighting her eyes with warmth. Hayes found himself momentarily speechless. The storm intensified as evening approached, rain pelting the roof and wind howling through the surrounding trees. They prepared a simple meal together, the small cabin growing comfortably warm from the fire. Despite their situation, or perhaps because of it, the tension between them gradually eased. "You never said what takes you to Fort Benton," Hayes ventured as they sat before the fire, rain drumming steadily overhead. Emma stared into the flames, her profile outlined in golden light. For a moment, Hayes thought she might deflect again, but then she sighed. My uncle is my only remaining family. He wrote to me a month ago that he's gravely ill. Consumption, she traced a pattern in the wooden floor with her finger. The letter took weeks to reach me in Denver. I fear I may already be too late. I'm sorry, Hayes said, genuinely moved by her plight. Is that why you're traveling cross-country instead of taking the regular routes, to save time? Partly, Emma admitted, but there's more. She hesitated, then reached into her pocket and withdrew a folded newspaper clipping. This is why I've been avoiding the main roads. Hayes accepted the worn paper and unfolded it carefully. It was a notice from the Helena newspaper, dated 3 weeks prior. The headline read, "Reward offered for information on Miss Emma Grayson." Below was a crude sketch that bore a reasonable resemblance to Emma. "Someone's looking for you," Hayes observed, reading further. "A Mr. Victor Caldwell of Denver offers $500 for information leading to your whereabouts." "Victor Caldwell is a wealthy businessman who's decided I'm to be his wife," Emma said bitterly. "He was my father's employer. When father died deeply in debt, Caldwell offered to forgive those debts in exchange for my hand in marriage." Hayes frowned. "That's hardly a proper proposal." "It wasn't meant to be, it was a business transaction." Emma's voice hardened. "He's 30 years my senior and has buried 2 wives already. I refused him, but he's not accustomed to being denied what he wants. When I fled Denver, he set his men to tracking me." The pieces fell into place for Hayes. "So you're traveling the back country to avoid his men, who might be watching the stagecoach routes and settlements." "Exactly." Emma looked up at him, vulnerability evident beneath her determined exterior. "I have no interest in being purchased, Mr. Hartwell, and I fear what Caldwell might do if he catches me before I reach my uncle's protection." Hayes felt a surge of anger at this unknown man who would treat a woman like property. "Well, he won't find you with me," he declared with unexpected vehemence. "I'll see you safely to Fort Benton, Miss Grayson. You have my word." Emma's expression softened with gratitude. "Thank you, Hayes." The sound of his name on her lips created an unfamiliar warmth in his chest. For the first time in years, Hayes felt something crack in the wall he'd built around himself, a hairline fracture in his carefully maintained isolation. They stayed awake long into the night, sharing stories of their lives before circumstances had thrown them together. Hayes learned that Emma was 21, educated partly in Boston before financial hardship had forced her father to bring her west. She'd assisted with his geological surveys, developing considerable knowledge of minerals and mining operations. In turn, Hayes shared tales of growing up on his family's small farm in Missouri before the war had scattered them to the winds. Morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having passed during the night. They set out early, now riding side by side rather than Hayes leading. The landscape opened before them, vast skies and rolling hills painted with spring wildflowers. "It's beautiful," Emma murmured, gazing across the valley. "It is," Hayes agreed, though he found himself looking not at the scenery but at the way sunlight played across Emma's face. By midday, they'd covered considerable ground. Hayes estimated they'd reach the Lazy H by the following afternoon. The thought brought mixed feelings. While he'd be able to offer Emma better protection at the ranch, it would also mark the beginning of the end of their journey together. As they stopped to rest the horses by a small stream, Hayes noticed riders on a distant ridge, 3 men moving parallel to their route. His instincts prickled with warning. "Mount up," he said quietly to Emma, who had been filling their canteens. She followed his gaze and immediately understood, gathering her things without question. They rode at a measured pace, not wanting to signal awareness or concern, but Hayes led them toward a stand of cottonwoods that would provide cover. "Could be innocent travelers," Emma suggested without much conviction. "Could be," Hayes agreed. "Let's not find out." They maintained their course through increasing woodland, but an hour later, Hayes spotted the riders again, closer now and definitely tracking their trail. "Caldwell's men?" he asked grimly. Emma nodded, her face pale. "It's possible. He employs several former bounty hunters." Hayes assessed their options rapidly. "There's an old trapper's cabin about 5 miles east of here. We can reach it before nightfall if we push hard. It's defensible and few know of its existence." They urged their horses faster, taking advantage of the increasingly dense forest to obscure their path. Hayes led them through a shallow stream for half a mile, then up a rocky slope where the horses would leave minimal tracks. By sunset, they'd reached the cabin, a sturdy if weathered structure tucked against a rocky hillside. "Stay with the horses," Hayes instructed, drawing his revolver as he approached the cabin cautiously. Finding it empty, he signaled to Emma. They quickly brought their mounts into a small lean-to attached to the cabin, a precaution against both detection and predators. The interior was dusty but intact, with a stone fireplace and crude furnishings. "We can't risk a fire," Hayes said, checking the cabin's single window. "The smoke would give us away." Emma nodded, arranging their bedrolls on opposite sides of the room. "Will they continue searching in the dark?" "Not if they're smart. These woods are treacherous at night." Hayes peered through the window at the deepening twilight. "But they'll resume at first light." They ate a cold supper of jerky and hardtack, speaking in whispers despite being alone. As darkness enveloped the cabin, the temperature dropped significantly. Emma shivered in her thin jacket. "Here," Hayes said, shrugging out of his coat and offering it to her. "I can't take your coat," she protested. "You'll freeze." "I'm used to the cold," he insisted, though in truth, the spring night's chill was penetrating. Emma regarded him stubbornly for a moment before proposing, "We could share it." "And the warmth." Hayes felt a flush rise up his neck, grateful for the darkness that concealed it. That would be practical. They arranged their bedrolls side by side, the coat spread over both of them as they lay stiffly, maintaining a careful distance despite their proximity. "Hayes," Emma whispered after several minutes of silence, "why are you helping me, the truth this time?" Hayes stared at the ceiling, considering. "When I first saw you by that campfire, singing alone in the wilderness, something just shifted. I've spent 3 years convinced that isolation was safety, that connections only led to loss." He paused, searching for words. "But watching you face your troubles with such courage, I realized I've been hiding, not living." The confession hung in the air between them, more revealing than Hayes had intended. He felt Emma shift beside him, turning to face him in the darkness. "Thank you for your honesty," she murmured, "and for seeing me as someone worth helping, not something to be possessed." Her hand found his beneath the coat, fingers intertwining with gentle pressure. Hayes' heart thundered in his chest at the simple contact. They lay that way, connected but chaste, until sleep eventually claimed them both. Dawn arrived with an unwelcome discovery. Hayes, checking their surroundings, spotted fresh hoofprints in the muddy earth near the cabin. "They were here," he told Emma urgently. "During the night, they know where we are." Emma's face paled. "How did they find us?" "These men are trackers," Hayes replied grimly. "Probably followed our trail until it got too dark, then resumed at first light." "What do we do?" Hayes considered their options. "We could try to outrun them, but they'd likely catch us in open country. We could stay and fight, but we're outnumbered." He rubbed his jaw, making a decision. "There's a third option. My ranch is just over that ridge to the northwest. If we can reach it, we'll have better odds. Shelter, supplies, men who work for me." "How far?" 10 miles, rough terrain. We'd have to push hard." Emma nodded without hesitation. "Then that's what we'll do." They prepared to leave with urgent efficiency. As Hayes saddled the horses, a shot rang out, the bullet splintering wood inches from his head. He dove for cover, dragging Emma down beside him. "They're here," he whispered, drawing his revolver. 3 riders had positioned themselves in the tree line 50 yards from the cabin. One called out, "Miss Grayson, Mr. Caldwell only wants what's rightfully his. Come peacefully and your companion doesn't have to die." Hayes glanced at Emma, whose eyes had hardened with determination. "I'm not property," she said through clenched teeth. "There's a back way through the lean-to," Hayes whispered. "When I start shooting, run for the horses. I'll cover you." "I won't leave you," Emma protested. "You won't." "I'll be right behind you." Hayes checked his revolver. "Ready." Emma nodded, gripping her derringer. Hayes fired 3 rapid shots toward the tree line, forcing the men to take cover. Emma dashed for the lean-to while Hayes continued providing covering fire. When she reached the horses, Hayes backed toward her, still shooting. "Go," he shouted, swinging into his saddle as Emma urged her mare forward. They galloped away from the cabin, weaving through dense trees as shots echoed behind them. Hayes led them up a steep incline, hoping the difficult terrain would slow their pursuers. They rode hard for nearly an hour, the sound of pursuit gradually fading. Just as Hayes began to hope they'd lost the men, Emma's horse stumbled on the rocky ground, nearly unseating her. The mare recovered but began favoring her right foreleg. "She's lamed," Emma said, dismounting quickly to check the injury. Hayes surveyed their surroundings. They were exposed on the hillside, still miles from the ranch. "Can she walk?" "Yes, but not quickly, and certainly not carrying me." The decision was inevitable. "We'll ride double on Dusty. He's strong enough to carry us both for a few miles." They transferred Emma's essentials to Hayes' saddlebags and left her injured mare with regretful pats. The gelding protested slightly at the doubled weight but moved forward steadily when Hayes urged him on. Emma sat behind Hayes, arms wrapped around his waist for stability. The enforced closeness created an awareness that made it difficult for Hayes to focus on their escape. The scent of her hair, the warmth of her body pressed against his back, the trust implied by her embrace, all combined to awaken feelings he'd long suppressed. They made slower progress with the shared mount, but Hayes knew these hills intimately. He led them through narrow passages and hidden valleys, always angling northwest toward the Lazy H. By mid-afternoon, exhaustion was taking its toll. Dusty's sides heaved with exertion and both riders were saddle-sore and parched. They paused at a small spring to drink and rest briefly. "We're close now," Hayes assured Emma, pointing to a distant ridge. "The ranch is just beyond that rise. Another hour, maybe less." Emma nodded, her face streaked with dust and fatigue. "Hayes, if something happens." "It won't," he interrupted firmly. "But if it does," she persisted, "I want you to know these past days have meant more to me than I can express. You've shown me that good men still exist in this world." Hayes found himself unable to respond, emotions tightening his throat. Instead, he reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. The moment shattered at the sound of approaching hooves. Their pursuers had found them. "Run for the ridge," Hayes urged, helping Emma back onto Dusty. "I'll hold them off." "Not without you," she insisted, gripping his arm. "Emma, please," Hayes implored. "The ranch is just over that rise. My foreman, Jenkins, and the hands will help you. Tell them I sent you. I won't leave you to die." The riders were visible now, 3 men approaching rapidly from the south. Hayes made a split-second decision, vaulting into the saddle behind Emma and spurring Dusty forward. The gelding responded valiantly, summoning hidden reserves of strength as they galloped toward the ridge. Shots rang out behind them, bullets whizzing past. Hayes felt Emma flinch as one came particularly close. They crested the ridge, and there below them lay the Lazy H Ranch, a collection of buildings nestled in a verdant valley, cattle grazing in nearby pastures. Almost there, Hayes encouraged as Dusty began the descent. A shot cracked the air, and Hayes felt a searing pain in his left shoulder. He grunted, swaying in the saddle. "Hayes," Emma cried, reaching back to steady him. "Keep going," he managed through gritted teeth. Dusty thundered down the slope, the ranch growing closer with each stride. Hayes could see figures moving in the yard now, alerted by the gunfire. Several men were mounting up, rifles in hand. The pursuing riders, seeing the reception committee forming, began to fall back. By the time Hayes and Emma reached the ranch yard, their pursuers had retreated to the ridge. "Mr. Hartwell," Jenkins, the weathered foreman, exclaimed as Hayes slid from the saddle, blood staining his shirt. "What in tarnation?" "3 men ridge," Hayes gasped, pointing, "pursuing us. Miss Grayson needs protection." The ranch hands didn't waste time on questions. 4 men rode out immediately, rifles ready, while Jenkins helped Hayes toward the main house. "I'm fine," Hayes protested weakly. "See to Miss Grayson." "I'm here," Emma said, supporting him from the other side. "Let's get you inside." The world began to blur around the edges as they helped him into the house. The last thing Hayes remembered was Emma's worried face hovering over him as darkness claimed his consciousness. He awoke to find sunlight streaming through unfamiliar curtains. Disoriented, Hayes tried to sit up, only to be halted by a sharp pain in his shoulder. "Careful," a gentle voice admonished. "You'll reopen the wound." Hayes turned to find Emma seated beside his bed, dark circles beneath her eyes suggesting she'd spent the night watching over him. Memory flooded back the chase, the gunshot reaching the ranch. "How long?" he asked, his voice rough. "Almost 20 hours," Emma replied, offering a cup of water. The bullet went clean through your shoulder. Jenkins says you were lucky. Hayes sipped gratefully. The men who were chasing us. Gone. Your ranch hands pursued them to the territorial border. They won't be back. Relief washed over Hayes. Good. Emma studied him, her expression unreadable. Jenkins told me about your family. About what you've endured. Hayes looked away, uncomfortable with her knowing the extent of his losses. He also told me how you've isolated yourself these past years, she continued softly. Taking all responsibility on your shoulders, refusing help, keeping everyone at a distance. Jenkins talks too much, Hayes muttered. He cares about you, Emma countered. They all do. I've spent the day learning what kind of man you truly are, Hayes Hartwell, not from what you've told me, but from how others speak of you. Hayes remained silent, unsure how to respond to the warmth in her voice. I sent a telegram to Fort Benton, Emma said, changing the subject. My uncle is still alive, though very weak. I need to reach him soon. The statement felt like a physical blow. Of course, she would continue her journey. Hayes had known all along their paths would diverge, yet the prospect now filled him with unexpected despair. I'll arrange an escort, he said stiffly, once the doctor says I can travel. Hayes, Emma began, then hesitated. She took a deep breath and continued, these past days have changed me, changed how I see the world and my place in it. They've changed me too, Hayes admitted quietly. Emma leaned forward, taking his hand in hers. I still need to go to Fort Benton, my uncle needs me, but, she met his eyes directly, I find myself hoping that journey doesn't mean goodbye. Hope, fragile and unfamiliar, bloomed in Hayes' chest. What are you saying, Emma? I'm saying that perhaps when my uncle's affairs are settled, I might find my way back to a certain ranch, if its owner would welcome me. He would, Hayes replied immediately, squeezing her hand. More than you know. The smile that illuminated Emma's face chased away the last shadows of Hayes' long isolation. She leaned forward, her lips meeting his in a gentle kiss that promised possibilities neither had dared imagine days before. 2 weeks later, Hayes stood on the porch of the Lazy H, watching a wagon disappear over the northern horizon. Emma had departed that morning for Fort Benton, accompanied by Jenkins and 2 ranch hands for protection. Hayes had wanted to go himself, but his still-healing wound made the long journey inadvisable. Their parting had been bittersweet, tempered by Emma's promise to return within a month. Hayes had pressed a small gold ring into her hand, his mother's wedding band preserved through war and hardship. Not a proposal, he'd clarified, but a promise, a reason to come back. Emma had kissed him deeply in response, whispering, I don't need the ring for that, but I'll treasure it all the same. Now, as the wagon faded from view, Hayes felt not the familiar emptiness of loss, but the novel anticipation of return. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a future beyond mere survival, a future with laughter and companionship, perhaps even family. The Lazy H no longer seemed a refuge from connection, but a foundation for it. As he turned back toward the house, Hayes smiled at the transformation a chance encounter by a campfire had wrought. His father had been wrong. Out here in the unforgiving West, attachments weren't weights to drag you under, they were anchors that kept you moored through life's storms. 1 month later, Hayes stood again on that same porch, watching not a departure but an arrival. The wagon approaching from the north carried precious cargo, Emma, her ailing uncle who had rallied enough to travel, and their modest belongings. As Hayes strode forward to welcome them home, he reflected on the unexpected gift that had come from that night when a cowboy saw a beautiful stranger alone by a campfire. In opening his heart to help another, he had ultimately saved himself. Emma descended from the wagon, her smile radiant as she rushed into Hayes' waiting embrace. Behind them, the Lazy H Ranch stood as witness to their reunion, no longer just a place of work and solitude, but now the foundation of a shared life on the frontier, built on courage, trust, and love.